You spend 4 months hunting a man across the high territory, and the day you finally find him sitting on a fence at dusk, the first thing his horse does is walk up to your mare and touch noses. That is the moment you know something about the man you have been hunting is going to undo you. The mare was Wren's. The horse that walked over and touched its lips to her was a long gray gelding named Smoke, and the man astride him didn't try to shove the animal back. He sat easy in the saddle and watched her come up the long stretch of Pinyon Forks Road with one hand resting on his horn, the way someone watches a thing they have already made peace with. The sun was just then sliding behind the western ridge, and the light on his face had the soft, tired color of old coins in the last useful hour of the day. There was a small bell on the mare that rang faintly each time the animal shifted her weight on the packed earth, and the bell was the only sound in the yard for what felt like a long time. If you are listening tonight and you have ever folded yourself into a kitchen chair for the second half of an evening, or pulled a quilt up to your knees in a parlor that doesn't get much company, drop me a line in the comments and tell me where you are listening from. We get letters from kitchens and cook stoves and front porches all the way across the country, and a few from places I did not grow up pronouncing, and I love knowing where this story is landing. Wren Aitcheson had ridden into a town that smelled of pinyon smoke and manure and the first cold bite of an autumn that hadn't quite committed to itself. She was hungry, saddle-sore, out of paid lodging by half a week's wages, and she had been thinking, for the last 50 miles, about the difference between finding a man and catching one. The Warings had paid $1,000 in gold for Trace McCurdy's body to be brought back across the border, the way the Warings had once paid $1,000 for the body of a man whose land they had wanted. They had offered this bounty to 3 hunters before her. None of them had come back with him. None of them had come back at all, except a saloon singer from Wichita who had taken the contract to keep her family fed through winter, had ridden west half-heartedly, and had come home with the report. "He isn't running, sister. He goes to ground. The ground hides him." Trace McCurdy wasn't gone. He was sitting 8 feet from her, on the second rail of a fence outside the livery, with a boy of maybe 9 beside him who was polishing a saddle cinch with a rag. The boy didn't look up when she stopped. The man did. He tipped his hat to her with a quiet courtesy that, even seeing him the way she had been hired to see him, she could not bring herself to dislike. His eyes were a steady brown and a little tired in the corners, the way people's eyes get when they have spent a long time being careful with what they look at. "He didn't run, Miss," he said. His voice was low, easy. "You came a long way." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and the moment stretched itself longer than she had wanted. She was used to a man making a sound at sight of her, a hard sound, a quick one, the sound a man makes when a long job is at last on his porch. He had not made that sound. He had made no sound at all. The town did not look the way she had imagined when she first took the contract. She had pictured something more desperate, a town full of the kind of men who would help the Warings hunt a man. Pinyon Forks had not helped them. She had drawn the same blank in 2 general stores, a hotel keeper's lodge, a saloon in the foothills, and in the dry goods of a widow named Pike, who had looked Wren once up and once down and had asked her, with her hands folded across her apron, if the Warings had come themselves this time. When Wren said no, the widow had not said yes and had not said no. She had turned back to her mending as if the answer to her question was the only useful thing she needed before deciding what she would do, which was nothing. The livery in which she now sat her mare was a low-roofed board structure that had no placard out front, and the man who ran it had not been in any of the towns the Warings had bought. It was a place people remembered to forget, the way a man remembers to forget the name of a horse he once had to sell. She tied her mare to the rail and looked at the boy and then at the man. "You know who I am," she said. It wasn't a question. "I know who you're working for," Trace said. "I know what they want delivered to them. Then you know I can take you." He held out his hands in front of her, palms up, the way a man lays his hand flat on a table when he wants you to see that neither of them is hiding anything. "I haven't moved, miss." She did not like the calm in him. She had been raised up by a father who had taught her the easiest hunting was always the dangerous hunting, and that a man who didn't run was either a fool or a man who had already decided what he was willing to die for. She couldn't read which Trace McCurdy was. She'd wanted to. He looked down at Colm, then up at her again. "You want water for the mare," he said. "The trough is at the second post. There's a bucket under the bench." He was offering her the small courtesies of the yard, the way you offer them to a guest. And she understood at once that she had arrived somewhere she had never been on any other contract. She had arrived somewhere a man had chosen to let her in. She walked the mare forward. She let the animal drink. She did not unsaddle him, because she had not yet decided whether she would be here by night. She let her hand rest on the mare's neck for a moment, the way a woman rests her hand on a thing she is not ready to leave. By the third evening of her stay, after she had walked the long stretch of trail at the edge of the livery's pasture and seen him, again, sitting on the same second rail of the same fence, with Colm asleep against his leg and smoke tied close enough to keep them both warm, she had told him, from 20 paces, that the Warings had sent her, that they were offering the original bounty and 100 on top, that the man they had put in the saddle at the end of the trail, the one who worked beside the marshal, would be in town within the week. She had said it with her hands loose at her sides, the way you speak when you want the other person to see your hands. He did not take the offer. He did not argue it. He said, "I have seen what they will do if I am brought home. Tell me I am wrong about that." She didn't tell him he was wrong. She couldn't. 2 years earlier, on a stretch of high prairie south of Abiquiu, Levi's son Cabe had come for a boy working a chuck line at a railroad camp, the same boy who would in time become Colm. The boy had been 9. Cabe had a bottle. Cabe had a pistol. Trace had thrown the boy behind him and had not drawn a pistol of his own. He had used his hands and his weight the way a man uses his weight when he must put a body down, and there is no other clean way to do it. He had thrown Cabe off the high wheel of a freight wagon, and the wagon's iron had been there to receive what Trace could not afford to receive in his own chest. Cabe had hit the iron on the way down. He had not gotten up. The Warings were a powerful ranching family. The marshal had been appointed by their money. The town where it had happened had been sown into silence by their riders. Trace had run, because he had known, with the plainness of an animal, that no jury chosen by those men would have weighed him and the boy by the same scale. He had not been wrong. She tied him, in spirit, to the rail of his own corral for the first night. Not because he asked her to, and not because she didn't trust him, but because there was a way her back had been raised to accept hunting as a discipline. She sat in the livery loft with her rifle across her knees and looked down at him through the boards, and he did not try to leave. He talked quietly to Smoke, who didn't seem to mind being ridden on by a stranger. He gave the boy his supper from his own pan. He was, she thought, somehow both the man she had been hired to fetch and the man she had been looking for, and the difference between those two men was the same difference she had been carrying in her own chest all of her 29 years. There is a name for the way a man stops running because he is waiting to be caught, and there is a separate name for the way a woman takes money to bring a man home and finds out what home is. If you have ever been the one doing the chasing and quietly known you are not really hunting, leave a word for me in the comments, because I think a great many of us have been on one end of that rope at some point. When she went down in the morning, he had already started the coffee. He did not ask her to leave. He said, to the boy, "Bring the lady a cup." Colm did, without looking up, the way a boy brings a cup to a lady he doesn't like yet, because the man who has raised him said so. She took the cup. He watched her. "You should not stay," he said. "I'm not paid to leave." Then for what it's worth, he said, "this is not the horse you want to take." He meant his horse. He meant more than the horse. He meant the Warings. He meant the bounty. He meant that the man she would hand him over to, when she got paid, would be a man she did not want to hand him over to. She understood. She did not yet admit she understood. For 11 days they held the strangest of all campfires between them. He tried not to be watched, but she watched him well, and the more she watched him, the more she saw the man she had been hired to fetch turn into a man she had not expected to meet. He broke horses and did not speak when he broke them. He held the bit and let the animal find its own way to give. He did not love the animal. He trusted it. The trusting was what undid the animal. There was a quietness in the way he moved around the corral, the way he held a gate, the way he untied a knot, that made her think he had been alone for so long his aloneness had become a kind of landscape he carried with him. She wanted to put a cup of coffee into his hands every morning. She didn't say so. She had not come up the trail to fall for a man. She had come up the trail to fetch him. Vance Calloway, the marshal's brother and the Warings' other hired hand, came into town on the 11th day. He came in with 2 rifles lashed to his saddle, a hard mouth, and his hat set low, and the Warings' family brand had been sewn into his saddle bags, because there is no hiding a thing like that. He had a reputation in 3 territories, and the reputation was not of a man who asked twice, and not of a man who rode home with a job unfinished. He tied at the saloon. He asked the proprietor where he could find the man called Trace McCurdy, and the proprietor pointed toward the livery without hesitating, because it was the habit of men who were used to losing to the Warings to lose to them in small ways before losing to them in the large ones. The town heard. The livery heard. The boy Colm heard. Wren heard. She walked the long pasture toward the livery when Calloway's horse came up the trail. Trace heard him too, and walked out of the back stall with his hands empty. He had always walked out with his hands empty. There was nothing to defend by picking up a pistol. The Warings had already loaded the verdict in the holster. She came into the yard with her rifle across the saddle. Calloway came up behind her. The boy stood at Trace's leg. Smoke was tied close. The air smelled of dust, of manure, of the first pulse of cold in the early dusk. "Step aside," Calloway said. He had a slow voice, a soft voice, the kind of voice men use when they have been told to do a thing and want it to look as if they chose to do it. Trace did not step aside. He raised his hands. "There's a man in this town who saw what happened," Wren said. "There is a witness. There has always been a witness." Calloway was a man of small patience. "Don't talk," he said. The witness was old Hal Beckett, a cowhand who had worked the Waring camp for 17 years and had been turned off the place for objecting, at length, to what their son had done at the railroad line. Hal had gone to ground in a homestead cabin in the foothills. He had not come forward because the Warings had publicly said they would do worse than turn a man off the place to any man who spoke. Hal was now in town. He had come in on the 7th night of Trace's 11 odd days in the open, when the Warings' hired hand had first come riding west, and he had been hiding in the livery's hayloft above the loft where Wren had kept watch. The boy Colm, who was a boy who read weather and so did not miss what was happening above his head, had quietly carried him bread each evening, walking past the loft with the loaf tucked under his arm as if he had been on an errand for the man who had raised him. Hal had been fed, over those 4 nights, by a boy he had never held a conversation with, in a town he had never been to, and he had understood, watching the boy's careful feed on the ladder, that he was being given back a thing he had not known he had lost. How was the coincidence? How was the quiet urn of 17 years? Hal had seen what Trace had done. Hal had known Trace had not done the thing the Warings had ridden out to claim he had done. Hal was also very, very tired of being afraid of powerful men. The way a man is tired of being afraid of a thing he has carried under his coat for so long, he has forgotten it is in his pocket. The boy looked up until he met Trace's eye. He said, "He's here." Trace made a sound he hadn't made in years. Calloway heard it, too, and his face moved as if he had been touched in a place he had thought he could keep private. "Marshall here will want to know why you've broken faith with the family," Calloway said to Wren. "I have broken faith with the family," Wren said. She was quiet when she said it. "I have kept faith with the man." The yard of the livery smelled of dust and the late, dry smell of a late autumn that had not yet committed to itself. There were more townspeople at the gate than she had realized there would be. They had come in 1s and 2s and had stood at distances they told themselves were just distances and not places. They had not come in numbers. They had come in presence. The housekeeper of the Widow Pike was there, who had not liked the Warings since before Trace had ever put a bullet through a barrel. The general store woman was there, who had given Wren a flat ration of beans 11 days before. The boy from the forge, the preacher's boy, the 2 no-account riders from the livery itself, who had been paid 10 cents a head over the years to keep their eyes on their own work. Trace took her hand. Her hand still had the gun oil from her days on the trail. She had not used a gun on him. He had never tried to take one from her. The hand was the hand of a man who had let himself be caught. "You will have to use your voice," she told him. "You will have to use yours," he said. The yard was quiet. Hal came out into the light. The way a man comes out into a light he has been circling for years. He looked like a man who had been eating dust for 2 years. He sat down on a crate at the rail and did not look up at Calloway. The thing we have often called the witness is rarer than we would like to think. Most of what a man can do for a story is to stand up just once, when it counts, and not have any further ambition to be a hero. She did not want to be thanked. Trace did not thank her. That reticence was the first thing she had ever loved about a man she had been paid to betray. That night, when Calloway had drunk the better part of a bottle and had ridden back west, The three of them sat at the long table of the back kitchen of the livery and ate what Colm had cooked, which was eggs and salt pork and a fresh loaf of bread from the widow pike. Wren did most of the talking. Trace did least of it. He was relieved in a way that men are relieved when they realize they do not have to be the only one carrying something difficult. Colm fell asleep against her arm. Trace looked at her across the table and said, very softly, the kind of soft that is meant to be carried out of a room, "Ain't it funny what a thing'll catch you when it wants to be caught?" She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to add. She let the boy sleep against her arm. She let the man keep looking at her. She understood she had already chosen him. I want to pause here for a moment and say what I think you are feeling, because I think a great many of you are feeling it. There's something in this story for the person who has been paid for the wrong reasons and quietly chose the right thing. There's something for the person who has been carried as a witness by a boy who has not spoken for 2 years. There is something in this story for any of us who have been told that what we did was a thing we couldn't undo, and learned, 1 or 2 years later, that someone had decided we could. If this lands with you the way it landed with me, leave us a like and subscribe, so more of these stories find the people who needed them. The paper that came next was a summons, written out longhand by Hal in a careful penmanship that shook only a little. The marshal's office received it on a Tuesday. The town of Pinyon Forks received the marshal on the Wednesday following, with his brother Vance walking in 2 paces behind. The trial was held in the open air under the standing trees at the eastern edge of town, because that was the only place enough good men would gather to make a jury, and because the Warings had come, by then, to understand that they had been defeated in a way no man in their family had ever been defeated before, which was by what they had actually done. The Warings had not lifted a hand against anyone in that yard. They had lost the room, and a man will tell you that losing a room is a different kind of losing, and not at all less total. It was a Saturday in early autumn. The sun had come clean over the eastern ridge. Hal was the first witness. Trace was the second. Wren was the third. She told what she had seen and what she had been told and what she had been paid to do. She told what she had chosen not to be paid for. The marshal looked down for the second time that morning, and a kind of weight shifted in his shoulders that the rest of the courtroom could feel without naming. The verdict came in the early afternoon. Trace was not convicted. The Warings were not ruined in the way ruined looks in stories for people you have grown to dislike. They were quietly rendered indifferent to the world they had spent so many years leaning against. They would never be able to ride to Pinyon Forks and expect to be bowed to again. Their brand on a saddlebag would never mean what it had meant. They would still own land. They would still run cattle. They would be smaller men for the rest of their lives, the way a wardrobe grows smaller when the tallest garment is gone. The marshal cleared his throat. He shook the boy's hand. He shook Wren's hand. He shook Trace's hand. He had quietly moved from being the Warings' marshal to being the marshal of a town, and that was a longer walk than most men could manage in a year, and he had managed it in 3 weeks. 3 weeks later, Trace and Wren married in the small church at the western edge of town. Colm had been rolled into the ceremony by the preacher's wife and was wearing the shirt she had made for the occasion, with 2 buttons already missing by the second him. The wedding was small and was attended by old Hal and the liveryman and the widow pike and the boy from the forge, and was the first wedding in Pinyon Forks in 7 years. This is the kind of thing a town quietly remembers for 60 years after, and tells the new preacher's wife about when she is packing her trunk. There was a small cake, made by the preacher's wife, and the boy ate 2 pieces of it before anyone had remembered to cut him a fork, which is the kind of detail a town tells itself much later when it is trying to recall what made a year feel, for once, like a turning year and not a passing one. When Trace stood with her beside the railing at the front of the church and looked down at the boy who had called him by his first name for 2 winters, he did not say so out loud, but a woman in the church who had raised 4 boys of her own could see in his shoulders that he had decided, in front of all of them, that he would do for Colm what Colm's father had not lived long enough to do. And that decision was the first thing Trace had ever wanted without running from it. She had not been the townswoman beforehand. She didn't entirely become the townswoman after. She was the hunter who had been hired to fetch him and had fished herself instead, who had known the difference between the rope and the man on the end of the rope, and who had let the rope go. She had been on the trail because $1,000 in gold would set her up for the rest of her life, and she had let the $1,000 go. There is no point in telling you she did it bravely. She did it the way a woman sets a thing down when she has carried it long enough to know that it is heavier than the rest of her life. He was a man who had been quiet about what he had done for 2 years, and had been quiet with her for 11 days, and had not been quiet with her at all in the 11 that followed. They lived at the livery and ran it together. He fed her coffee at dawn, which is what she had been raised to do for the men in her family, and she fed him coffee at noon, which is what he had not been raised to expect. The boy spent his days with the man who had saved him and with the woman who had been saved by him. The boy learned to build a fence the way you break a horse, by holding a wire long enough that the wood learns what it will be. He learned to read weather in a way that was a kind of love. He had, by spring, 2 brothers and a sister, and there were mornings when he sat at the long kitchen table with the baby on his lap and explained the sunrise to her, as if the sunrise would have been lonely without her being told about it. The last morning I will tell you about is the morning of the first real rain of autumn, 2.5 years after the wedding. The boy had grown tall enough to braid a mane alone. The livery had a sign now, with Trace's name and Wren's name beside each other in paint, and below them Colm's name in smaller letters, because the man who had raised him had insisted the boy be on the sign the same as they were. The horses were in their stalls. Smoke was 15 years old and nicked the rail with his lip when a stranger came near, but lowered his head when Trace came near and added his lips to a new mare's lips in greeting, the way he had done the first afternoon in the dust. Wren came out of the kitchen with the second pot of coffee. The boy was in the doorway braiding a horse's mane. Trace was sitting on the second rail of a fence he had built himself. She sat down beside him, the way she had watched him do the first day. He did not take her hand. They did not need to. The rain was just beginning to come down over the long pasture in long, slow lines, the kind of rain that means a season has finally decided what it is. He looked out at the pasture, and he said, "The horses get to choose their morning, after all. And I sit here, telling you this, because the man who had been hunted by $1,000 in gold for 2 years had quietly built, in the same small town he had almost been killed in, a fence and a kettle and a boy who called him by his first name, and a woman who had chased him across the territory and had only ever been chasing him because she had finally found the man she had been chasing all of her own life. Some of us walk a long road before we understand the difference between the man we are looking for and the man who has been waiting on us all along. The man who lets himself be caught is not the one who has stopped trying. He is the one who has finally found the thing worth being caught for. If you'd like to settle in for another one, the next story is about a young widow who returns to the ranch that once paid her father and meets a saddle maker who has been waiting 18 years for her to come home. Tell me, in the comments, what the time of night is where you are. There is a story coming at sundown tomorrow, and I would like to send it to you warm.